The way that I define addiction, addiction occurs anytime we're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. What causes the addiction to be so powerful is it is driven by a legitimate need. Another way that we talk about it is, we ask the person struggling with addiction, when did sexual arousal become the solution to all your problems? When did you begin to believe that some sort of sexual experience was going to rescue you from something and rescue you to something? And it's digging into my story to understand what is the legitimate need that I've sexualized. Because when I start to meet that legitimate need in a legitimate way, I begin to experience freedom.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. On today's program, we again would like to revisit the Betrayal Healing Conference with Tammy Gustafson. Her special guest is Dr. Greg Miller. Greg will be discussing with Tammy about understanding sexual compulsivity. And we hope that this subject matter and this podcast will be of great interest to you. Here now is Dr. Greg Miller and Tammy Gustafson and the Faithful and True podcast.
So as we dive into this topic of really kind of understanding sexual addiction 101, let's just start with how do we approach sexual addiction in a way that kind of helps have a more comprehensive understanding, including behavior and motivation?
Right. Well, one of the things that we would say is first, whatever language somebody is using to talk about this issue is important. And so for some people, they might talk about sexual compulsivity, they might talk about sexual addiction, they might talk about unwanted sexual behavior. For people of faith, they might talk about it as a sin problem or a lust problem. What we really want people to understand is whatever language you use, it's important that that language challenges you to take this seriously. That one of the sayings of AA is half measures availed us nothing. So to just have a casual approach is really not going to create the change that you're looking for. So when we talk about taking it seriously, one thing is we don't want people to minimize it, but the other thing is we don't want people to catastrophize it. And one of the ways that we can know we're catastrophizing it is we are left with no hope. We do believe that even if you've identified sexual addiction, there is a way forward if you have the right approach and the right understanding. The other thing is, whenever we're talking about sexual addiction or sexual compulsivity, whatever language you use, it's important that we recognize the complexity. This isn't a simple solution, and a lot of people are offering a simple solution to a complex problem, and in the end, they just look foolish. And so when we're talking to men about sexual compulsivity, we are going to address the behavior. Because what we know is if somebody is in a destructive behavior, we want to do everything we can do to support them so that behavior can end as quickly as possible. The other piece, that you've identified is we want to understand the motivation. What is driving the behavior? I often talk about if all we're trying to do is put out the flame, but we don't understand the source of the fuel, we won't be successful. It's kind of like having a gas fire, and all we're trying to do is put out the flame, but until we turn off the source of gas, it's going to continue. So we want to deal with the damage the flame has created, but we also want to understand what is the gas source that's been driving it.
I love how you put that. And that really speaks to the deeper recovery work that has to happen, right? Yeah.
Right. I often say this isn't a problem we solve. This is a wound we heal. That our chaos is driven by old pain that's never been acknowledged. And so it is about understanding what is driving this and healing that old wound and those old negative core beliefs.
So that issue that you're talking about of calling it sexual addiction or sexual compulsivity or all the other things, what are some reasons that you see that people resist kind of that diagnosis?
Yeah, well, I think there's two. One is someone or somewhere in their life, somebody has used an addiction as an excuse for their behavior. If you're familiar with the 12 steps, the first step is we admit our powerlessness. And I think some people have misinterpreted that to say, well, if I'm powerless over it, then I'm not responsible for it. And so part of it is recognizing that addiction can be the diagnosis. It is never the excuse for somebody's behavior. And so if you're in someone or someone is in your life and they're justifying their behavior because it's an addiction, they're really not understanding the 12 steps. What I often say is in the first step, I am powerless over my addiction, and yet I am powerful in my recovery. When I bring my agency to begin to implement the change that I need, that's when I begin to experience transformation. I think,
So go ahead.
and I would just say the other one is people are afraid that addict is going to become their identity. That if I admit I'm struggling with an addiction, is that going to define me for the rest of my life? Will I always introduce myself or see myself through that lens? And what I want people to understand is addiction can be part of the story. It's not all of the story. Addiction can be part of my truth. It's not all of my truth. And it never becomes who I am. I don't believe we are defined by our behavior. I think we are defined by our understanding of self.
So if we take a step back for a moment and look at this through the lens of the betrayed partner, it is really hard and scary as a betrayed partner to have that label on your partner for some.
Right.
And I just want to acknowledge that there's also this piece, like there's might be the struggle that the betrayer has with that, but there's also this other piece of going like, oh my gosh, like what does this mean? And like there can actually be shame that the betrayed partner feeling
Right.
like I am associated with someone who's a sex addict. And so I just want to I want to acknowledge that, and I love your thoughts on that. But the other piece with betrayed partners too that I hear a lot is what you're talking about sometimes it can be used, well, like if he's an addict, I guess he's just going to relapse. I guess this is just he just can't think clearly. So can you speak to maybe two of those points that betrayed partners struggle with?
Absolutely. And I do want to validate that this idea of addiction is kind of the diagnosis that nobody wants. And it
Oh,
can
right.
feel very hopeless. It can feel very, create a lot of despair. What's true is there are sometimes we get a diagnosis that is painful. Several years ago, our younger son was just going through a lot of stuff physically. And we took him to a variety of different doctors, had a bunch of tests. We weren't getting a clear diagnosis. And I think it was like the 10th or 11th doctor that finally gave us the diagnosis. And to be honest, it was not the diagnosis that we wanted. And the diagnosis itself was difficult and painful and scary. We had so many questions. But what also happened was once we got the proper diagnosis and we started getting the proper treatment plan, he started to be well. And so a lot of times when we hear that original diagnosis of addiction, it is scary and we can feel a lot of despair. And yet, if that is the proper diagnosis, there is a treatment plan that makes a difference. Now, the patient or the person struggling with the addiction has to be willing to do the work. That is foundational. Just knowing the diagnosis and maybe having an understanding of it does not lead to transformation. It's my willingness to go after it and do whatever I have to do to be well. And so for those wives that are concerned that this may be their husband's diagnosis, I want to validate all of the chaos that diagnosis creates. And I also want to offer hope. I also think that probably for a lot of wives, what's so scary is they intuitively know that it's up to their husbands to be willing to do the work. That in some way they are powerless over their husband's addiction and choices. And so it is scary to watch somebody else to see, are they willing to do whatever it takes for them to be well and free? And I think that that's part of the chaos too.
Can you also speak to the message that a lot of betrayed partners get with that diagnosis of addiction of there's this, well, he's going to relapse. I mean, he's an addict and that's what addicts do. And he's just going to relapse and I just have to accept it. And like he's just going to be in that addictive fog, and I guess I just have to accept it, is the message they get sometimes
Oh, absolutely.
because he's an addict. And I hate that disempowerment
Right.
that is spoken. Can you speak to that?
Well, part of the way I like to talk about it is relapse is always a possibility, and it is not an inevitability. It's not guaranteed. So someone who has the addiction has options, they have choices. And if they're willing to do whatever it takes to be well, then they're going to experience wellness. It's back to that idea of half measures availed us nothing. I mean, in the early days of AA, that was one of the realities, is that the addiction is powerful. The way that I define addiction occurs anytime we're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. What causes the addiction to be so powerful is it is driven by a legitimate need. Another way that we talk about it is, we ask the person struggling with addiction, when did sexual arousal become the solution to all your problems? When did you begin to believe that some sort of sexual experience was going to rescue you from something and rescue you to something? And it's digging into my story to understand what is the legitimate need that I've sexualized. Because when I start to meet that legitimate need in a legitimate way, I begin to experience freedom. So if addiction is trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern, recovery is identifying the legitimate need and meeting it legitimately. What happens is some people sexualize a sense of connection, so they can only feel connected if they're being sexual. Somebody else might sexualize the desire to be rescued from their insecurities. So if someone's choosing me sexually, either in fantasy or reality or in pornography, I get to imagine that I get rescued from my insecurities. And so that's part of the work that we have to do, is figure out what is that legitimate need. And for a lot of women, it makes perfect sense that this creates a lot of pain and chaos for them, because they come to the relationship with an expectation that sexuality is going to be about connection and intimacy. But for the person struggling with addiction, consciously and unconsciously, sexuality is about rescue. It's about a belief that this is going to solve my problems or rescue me from something. And it makes sense that it's dissatisfying, because it never can do what we want it to do in that unhealthy, addictive way.
So, Greg, maybe you started on this, but what are a few of the foundational principles of sex addiction that are important to understand?
Well, I would say the first one is the realization that sex addiction is not about sex. It's about how a person is using sex. And that's going to come out of their story. That's the first time that they were exposed to something sexual. I hear a lot of men talk about being about 10 years old and being first exposed to pornography. And because of the neurochemistry of sexuality, immediately they feel a relief. They feel a shift. And it's not because they're this disgusting little boy. It's because of the neurochemistry of sexuality shifts those neurochemicals in such a way that I start to feel better about who I am. I start to have a sense of well-being. I start to have that rush of dopamine or oxytocin. And so what happens as the little boy is exposed to pornography, he begins to use pornography in a way that creates a sense of relief or hope. Kind of the imagery that I use is, let's say I'm a little boy and I'm overwhelmed by life, and I start to discover pornography and masturbation. And so when I feel anxious, I begin to turn to masturbation and pornography to rescue me from my anxiety. When I feel lonely or insecure, I begin to use pornography and masturbation to rescue me from my insecurities. I hear a lot of men talk about, because of their anxiety, because their brains are racing, they begin to use masturbation as their sleep aid. So suddenly what's happening is, it's not about some sort of sexual experience. It's about masturbation and pornography has become their anxiety medication or their pain reliever, or in some case, their sleep aid. So it's no longer about some sort of sexual experience. It's no longer about intimacy and connection. It's about manipulating the neurochemistry to receive a result. And we often talk about all sex addicts are drug addicts. It's just that the drugs are not found on the streets. It's found in their brains. They're using masturbation or whatever their sexual acting out is to manipulate the neurochemistry. So the first principle is, sex addiction is not about sex. It's about how we use sex, and that's going to come from our story. The second principle is, sex addiction is powerful because it is driven by a legitimate need, and the legitimate need is not for more sex. And one of the mistakes that we make is, if I'm struggling with sex addiction, if I can just have enough sex, I will be satisfied. It's kind of like telling the alcoholic, you need to drink more to resolve your alcoholism. It doesn't work that way. So part of it is recognizing I've got to figure out what is that legitimate need and begin to meet it in a legitimate way. If I have anxiety, I can't use sexuality to manage my anxiety. I have to find other type of support to deal with my anxiety. If I'm feeling lonely and insecure, I can't use sex to rescue me from my loneliness and insecurity. I have to find healthy ways to address my insecurity, to deal with the pain of judgment or criticism from my childhood, so I don't live with those old lies that were created. So the second principle is sex addiction is powerful because it's driven by a legitimate need. And then the third principle is sex addiction initially chooses you, and then at some point you choose it back. And what I mean by that is, if I'm a little boy, and we also know that sex addiction is an issue that women deal with too, but if I'm a little boy or a little girl and I'm exposed to something sexual, there are two things that happen. The first thing is I become curious about sex. Curiosity is a great thing. Curiosity is a part of who we were created to be. Curiosity is that invitation to explore that which we don't understand. So if I'm a little boy and I'm exposed to bugs, I become curious about bugs. If I am exposed to the stars, if someone starts pointing out the stars, I become curious about astronomy. And if I'm introduced to something sexual, I become curious about sex. I want to explore. I want to understand. And that drives me. One of the mistakes that a lot of the men who come to our workshop have is they believe that early on they had a high sex drive. And what I want them to understand is, as a little boy, it wasn't a sexual drive. It was a sexual curiosity. The other thing, though, that happens is if a child is exposed to something sexual, then they begin to experience shame. And the way that I think this works is, as children, we intuitively know that we are not able to navigate the complexity of sexuality. It's like who we are, just understand this is an adult issue. This is beyond us. So when a little boy is exposed to something sexual, his curiosity moves him towards it. But that awareness that this is something beyond me sends him into hiding. The original shame message is there's something wrong with me. And for that little boy exposed to something sexual, the reality is there's nothing wrong with him. He's responding the way that he was created to respond. What's wrong is he is not prepared to navigate the complexity of sexuality. But in his innocence and his childhood perspective, he simply begins to believe that there's something wrong with him. So you can see the chaos. I'm drawn to sexuality out of curiosity, but I have shame about my sexual curiosity that sends me into hiding that actually gives it more power. So the first part is early on, sex addiction chose me. That first time I was exposed to something. And the second part is, and I chose it back. That's when we begin to use sex to rescue us. That's when it becomes our anxiety medication or our pain reliever. We're now using it to be rescued. And I often say, have grace for that little boy part of you that was first exposed to something sexual, and take responsibility and own that part of you that chose it back.
Yeah. So what would you say are the defining components of sex addiction?
Well, there are 7 things that we look at. The first one is unmanageability. And what we mean by unmanageability, a kind of a great way to identify it is, if I've ever done something sexually that I promised myself I would never do, it's unmanageable. If I've ever crossed a line. One of the things I talk about addiction is when we lose our yes and we lose our no. I don't have a no to the things that are robbing me of life, and I don't have a yes to the things that bring me life. So if I've lost my yes and my no, if I'm doing things I promised myself I would never do, then that's the sign of unmanageability. There's also that piece where in the moment I tell myself it's okay. That's the losing of my no. And that giving myself permission is a huge part of the addiction. Most of the men that we work with have some understanding of morality. They have a desire to be faithful. They want to honor their marriage. And they have some sort of sense of faith. And yet they find themselves saying yes to this thing that's really creating pain and chaos that they know they shouldn't be doing. That's unmanageability. The second thing is this idea of creates neurochemical tolerance. And what we mean by that is part of the brain and the way that it was created is neuroplasticity. Our brain has the ability to adjust to whatever we put into it. An example I would use is, let's say I'm a little boy and I'm first exposed to a magazine. I see the image of someone that is naked. Well, part of sexual arousal is adrenaline. My brain just naturally reduces adrenaline. So I'm excited. I'm experiencing adrenaline. So I take that image back to my house. I look at it. I'm curious about it. But over time, I become bored with it. Not because the image has changed, but because my brain has adjusted to the adrenaline I'm putting into it. And what once felt exciting has now become boring. So I need more stimuli to create the same sense of adrenaline, even though my brain is producing the same amount of adrenaline. I've adjusted to it, and now it's no longer exciting or satisfying. So if I'm experiencing neurochemical tolerance, the way that shows up is through addiction being progressive. So another component of addiction is it is progressive. It doesn't stay stagnant. That's why we see the escalation. I start by looking at images, and then I become bored with that. So now I want to interact with somebody. So I go to a place, or I pay for an experience where there's somebody there with me. I become bored with that, so I keep just escalating my behavior. But there's another way that it escalates, and that is I may not change my behavior, but it just escalates in the same context. We work with a lot of men that have exclusively looked at pornography. They've not crossed a flash line with anybody else. But even in their pornography, we've seen a progression. Maybe they started looking at it once a month, and it was once a week, and now it's once a day or several times a day. That's a form of progression. Or maybe the types of pornography I'm looking at has changed. That can be progressive. So again, when we have neurochemical tolerance, we're also going to experience progression. The next thing is that it's used to medicate feelings. And it can show up two ways. I've already mentioned that I can use sexuality to try to manage my anxiety. And so I use it to comfort myself and soothe myself. But what's also interesting is we can use it to create the emotions that we want. I think there's a lot of men that use their sexuality as their depression medication. They feel apathetic. They feel lethargic. And they use that rush of adrenaline to give them a boost to try to start their day. And so they're now using sexuality as their depression medication. So it's used to medicate feelings, either avoid the feelings we don't want or to create the emotions that we do want. And then another one, number 5, is it's fueled by entitlement. And 5 and 6 are similar. One is fueled by entitlement. The other is used as a reward. And the thing about entitlement says, I deserve this. Reward says, I have earned this. And the reason that these are so important is, again, this is what gives me permission to do the things I'm doing. As soon as I tell myself I deserve it, then I've given myself permission to do it. As soon as I believe I've earned it, then I've given myself permission to do it. And so we really want men to understand, how are these messages working? And one of the things about entitlement is, in order for there to be entitlement, there needs to be a core belief that justifies my behavior. An example would be, let's say I grew up believing, and maybe I was told, life is supposed to be fair. And I have an understanding of what fairness is. So somewhere in my life, I experience something, and I go, that's not fair. Well, then I tell myself, well, because life is supposed to be fair, and this isn't fair, I deserve to act out. Another way that this shows up in marriages that I think is so destructive is a lot of men go into marriage believing that now they're married, they should always have access to their wife's sexuality. There's an entitlement there. Now that we're married, I deserve sex. And so if the wife isn't interested for any reason, what happens is easy, well, my wife is supposed to be available to me. She's not, so I deserve to act out. And you can see how toxic and destructive that messaging can be. And then the final thing is that it creates a sense of power. One of the ways that we know an addiction is present is the great irony of addiction. I'm powerless, but in my acting out, temporarily I feel powerful. And it can show up in the way that I act out. You know, for some men, it's the power over the computer and the images. If I'm If bored with something, I can get a new image. I can click on something I'm interested in. It can be the power of using apps to act out sexually with somebody else. I can swipe right or swipe left. Or for some men, it's actually in the sexual experience. They want to feel powerful or dominant or controlling. And so if any of these 7 are going to show up, they're going to be indication that there is this compulsive energy or this addiction energy in the way that they're using sexuality.
So, Greg, shifting gears a little bit, um, where does a person find hope and a way forward?
I really do believe it's in understanding the healing that is necessary. Because if all I'm trying to do is stop a behavior, the image that I use, it's kind of like mowing your grass thinking it's going to get rid of the weeds. I can mow my grass, and when I first mow my grass, it looks great because anything green and short looks good. But if I've got weeds, the only way to get rid of the weeds is to go after the roots. It really is about being willing to do the work to understand what's driving the behavior. And if addiction is driven by unresolved or unhealed pain, ironically, recovery is the willingness to move towards the pain I've been willing to medicate. Addiction is about avoidance. So it makes sense that recovery is about engagement. Instead of ignoring old pain, instead of ignoring the lies of shame, I'm actually going to move towards it. I regularly use the image that we move towards, we move through, we move beyond. And it's in that moving towards we actually find hope. It's the moving through that we find hope. And absolutely, it's moving beyond that we find hope.
So, Greg, just a final question. And you've spoken to this, but I want to ask you directly. Is it possible for somebody to heal from sex addiction?
Absolutely. I believe it's possible for someone to be sober and to not go back to the old patterns of acting out. One of the interesting dynamics is there's a cultural message that this is just who guys are, that men are going to lust, that we were just created with this type of sexual desire, and we're not easily satiated, and so therefore we almost have permission to do what we want to do. And I just don't believe that that's accurate. I do believe that there's a context in which sexuality can be experienced in its greatest form, and it's in the context of commitment and exclusivity. And so for the guy who says, well, this is just who I am, what I would encourage him to say, but is this who you want to be? Do you want to be that person that doesn't fully realize the beauty of commitment for the long term, to experience that beauty of the culture of two, where this is just between the two of us? I don't think that lust is inevitable. I don't think that acting out is inevitable. And so when I begin to live in the truth that restraint and boundaries is possible, then I can fully live in the way that I was intended.
Greg, thank you so much for providing clarity and understanding. Beautifully done. And for also providing hope that yes, this is serious, and yes, this is hard, and yes, there's a lot of work that has to be done, and the work can be done, and there can be healing. All of that is true.
Thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that today's program has been helpful to you. We also hope that you'll visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of resources and over 550 additional podcasts that you can enjoy whenever you can find the time. In the meantime, we hope this coming week will be a week filled with great vision and many blessings.